if you were to take the top 30 or so wrestling superstars, the WWE, send them across the country into different regions where they would be the local champion, you wouldn't ever get to see him on the internet. You wouldn't get to see him on TV. You'd have to show up and actually watch him. You'd have to go to your local sports arena or one a few states over and watch your guy beat up local tough guys. Once in a while, there'd be some legitimate monster coming in, monster figuratively, as a bad guy who's just as talented or skillful as your local hero, but equally as devious and prone to insidious tactics. What you may actually have the national champion come through, bring their title, and your guy might win, beat him, and probably shortly thereafter lose it, so that he can take that title to go to a different territory and defend it. As weird as that sounds, that's the way wrestling was in the 1980s during the territory system. I was born in 1983. That territory system was still functioning. It was still going around. By the time I started becoming a fan, when I was 3 going on 4 years old, that territory system was almost completely dissolved, and WWE was at the height of their game shortly after WrestleMania 3, where Hulk Hogan fought Andre the Giant. I'm gonna go over how the WWF at the time they were called quickly rose the ranks from a regional promotion on the East Coast to being the preeminent wrestling organization in the entire world by the end of the 80s. We'll go over what the territory system was. Vince McMahon Jr., shortly after he bought the WWF from his father and bring in Hulk Hogan, created Hulkamania, and eventually leading into WrestleMania, which is still going today long after Hulk Hogan has retired. So, territories. In the early 80s, there were about 30 territories governed by a collaborative organization called the National Wrestling Alliance, or NWA. They'd have regional shows, or each region would have their own shows, and they wouldn't encroach on other people's territory. They'd share talent. They'd have a national champion that went around defending his belt to the local talent. Sometimes he'd lose it. Usually he'd win it back and go somewhere else. The WWF had their champion in the East Coast for a long time in the 70s. It was a guy named Bruno Sammartino. He had it for almost entire throughout the 60s and towards the mid 70s. He ended up transitioning the title over to a guy named Bob Backlund. And the way it worked was he didn't lose the title to Bob Backlund. He'd lose it to a bad guy or a heel. In this case, it was superstar Billy Graham. He'd lose the title. Billy Graham would have the title for not very long. Bob Backlund would beat him and go on to hold the title for many, many years. And during the 80s, he was the champion. There are other promotions trying to expand their territory at the time. Jim Crockett Promotions, they had a product called Georgia Championship Wrestling out of the Southeast, which eventually turned into World Championship Wrestling, who became the main competitor of WWF through the late 80s and early 90s and into the early 2000s. Their main champion is Ric Flair. He was the one going around winning and losing the belt to the regional champions. There is an organization outside of the NWA called the American Wrestling Association. They were based out of Minneapolis, headed by a promoter named Vern Gagne, who was a legitimate NCAA champion for the University of Minnesota, and they had Hulk Hogan fresh off a Rocky, known as Thunder Lips. Gagne wouldn't put the title on Hogan, so Hogan, wanting more money and greener pastures, decided he'd go to WWF, who at the time was the most profitable company, because Vince McMahon was infiltrating on the other territories. They left the NWA. Vince McMahon, shortly after he bought it from his ailing father, started doing national syndicated television, showing up in their paying customers' homes and didn't have to go to the arenas to run them out of business. Through these ad sales from the syndicated program, he was able to got the other territories from the inside out by signing their talent. You give their guys larger than life names and gimmicks like Jake the Snake Roberts, who took a python in a burlap sack to the ring. Um, Big Bubba Rogers became Big Boss Man, who was a night guard or a security guard, a correctional officer. He'd handcuff the opponent's hands to the ropes and beat him with a nightstick. Um, Hulk Hogan went to WWF as the biggest face, and he was transitioned into their champion by not by beating Bob Backlund, but by beating the Sheik, who was the guy who beat Bob Backlund. Quickly, he became consistent in how he was presenting himself with yellow tights, the 3 commandments of train, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, and quickly turned into a very big star. Vince, he had the roster loaded with talent. He wanted to tour the country, but to raise money, he'd have to hold a big event and basically bet the house that he could raise enough money to do this, to have his vision. So in came WrestleMania. WrestleMania was not like you see today. You had to watch it through closed circuit television, which means you had to go to a movie theater, a sports arena, and they'd pipe the feed directly into those places from the live event venue, and you could watch the event. You had to buy a ticket and show up. There were some pretty big matches in WrestleMania, and it was a success. He did make the money. Andre the Giant versus Big Dotson in the Body Slam Challenge. King Kong Bundy beat Special Delivery Jones in like 9 seconds. Main event was Hulk Hogan and Mr. T, also in the Rocky movie, versus Roddy Piper and Bob Orton. He was successful, and quickly a year later, WrestleMania 2, you got Andre the Giant winning the Battle Royal with half pro wrestlers, half NFL superstars. That was out of Chicago because he had 3 events going at the same time for this one. New York had Roddy Piper boxing Mr. T. Again, those 2 guys were there. And then finally in LA, the main event was Hulk Hogan and King Kong Bundy in a steel cage match, and Hulk Hogan once again prevailing in the main event. Finally, WrestleMania 3, 1987. Andre and Hulk Hogan were friends and soon to be rivals. Andre was in failing health, his career was on a downturn, and they know they had to have this big match now or never. Hulk Hogan won in front of 80,000 fans from the Pontiac Silverdome, which is arguably the biggest event they've ever had. And shortly after that is where I had my first memories. I came online. One of my first memories is picking out a birthday cake for my birthday, which my mom had these 2 tins she showed me. One was G.I. Joe, one was Macho Man Randy Savage. I picked the Macho Man Randy Savage tin. I remember for that birthday, I'm getting the WWF ring and action figures I saw on the commercials. I remember watching wrestling, watching Hulk Hogan, watching him talk about saying your prayers, eating your vitamins, and training. And I didn't know at the time, but I was riding the crest of the biggest wave in the history of the business. So it continues to be an annual tradition. WrestleMania 39 just happened in April. WrestleMania 40 will be next year. The CCT model was quickly replaced by the pay-per-view model, where you get it from your cable station, and that was replaced to today where we have in the streaming services. And that's what it is. They went from the territory system, and quickly they dismantled that with Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania, and then he brought in WrestleMania, which continues to this day. And that's what it is. It was a regional promotion, and they became a dominant global powerhouse by the end of the decade. However it's consumed, wrestling is still the same as it ever was. You cheer for the good guy, you boo for the bad guy, and you stay glued to the action and see what happens next.